Welcome back, boys and ghouls. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor. Hit that like button, get in the comments section below, and let me know. Share these videos with your friends, and if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. But now, it is trivia time. There has been a lot said about Image Comics and its founders over the last 28 years, but there's a fact that usually simply gets glossed over if it's mentioned at all these days, and it is the actual reason that Image Comics started. It's like Image Comics ground zero. I think a lot of people glossing over it has to do with the involvement of Rob Liefeld. I know that Rob Liefeld says some kind of off-the-wall stuff sometimes, and he isn't the most popular guy these days, which is especially ironic because his popularity is the entire reason that Image Comics exists at all. It was in fact a little-known ad that Rob Liefeld ran on a lark in the Comics Buyer's Guide that sparked the embers of what would become a full-fledged, if initially inadvertent, revolution in only a matter of months. Join me tonight as we talk about the ad that started the idea of Image Comics and the Sothebys Auction that sealed the deal, and a titillating tale of trivia that I'm calling the real reason Rob Liefeld founded Image Comics. I know, super original. You try coming up with better stuff every week. Flashback to the hazy collector-fueled days of the early 1990s market. It was a strange time when you would often see well-dressed men in suits ordering pallets of books from your local comic shop, otherwise filled with pimply-faced teenage albinos. These men were disillusioned trading card collectors looking for new investments after the bottom completely fell out of the baseball card market. Seeing the rising prices of vintage comics, these guys eagerly dumped thousands of dollars into any and all speculator books that they could manage to get their hands on. While Marvel and DC scrambled for the sweaty wads of cash people were throwing at store owners, an unseen upstart came along seemingly overnight out of nowhere and took the industry by storm, irrevocably changing the face of comics forever. When they started, people gawked at Image Comics, accusing them of being all style and no substance, and at the time they might have been right more often than not. But before the end of the decade, DC would have killed Superman, cloned him, and then resurrected him, and broken Batman's back just to try and compete. Marvel revealed Peter Parker was a clone and introduced the real Spider-Man, Ben Reilly, as the Scarlet Spider. They killed Aunt May, only to then reveal that was only a dream, and Ben Reilly was actually the clone, maybe, but only if you like that better. It was a mess, and by it I mean the entire industry. Image was not exempt from the infectiously bad writing and over-rendered art that pervaded the industry, but amongst the rubble of this destructive wave of upheaval, Image Comics has emerged to repeatedly defy expectations, providing a safe home for creator-owned properties for the better part of 3 decades at this point. They stayed their course, and now almost 30 years later, they not only stand toe-to-toe with Marvel and DC, pound for pound, they put out better books. Image Comics is almost a legacy, a myth at this point, the details and reasons of its creation lost in the misty haze of the time that shrouds the 90s like the smoke pouring out of Bill Clinton's Oval Office with a pleasant wave of jazz. The true origins of Image Comics are at once simplistic and yet intriguingly complex as well. So join me as we explore where this idea to start a creator-owned confederacy of artists and their creator-owned characters that would call themselves Image Comics came to Rob Liefeld from, and why the other Image founders decided to come along for the ride. And buckle up, because this gets crazy. To tell the story of Image, you have to tell the story of Rob Liefeld, at least in part. In 1985, a young teenager at the time, Liefeld broke into the industry working with a man named Gary Coulson on a book called Megaton. If Megaton sounds at all familiar, it's probably because you're familiar with Erik Larsen's work on the title. The first issue of Megaton was Larsen's first professionally published work, and he debuted the prototype of Savage Dragon, then simply named The Dragon, in the pages of issue 3. While working on Megaton, Liefeld and Larsen met, and it ended up that they got along pretty well. Between 1985 and 1987, Liefeld did some minor work, mostly inking and layouts, some pinups, and other various work for Coulson on the Megaton title. The two developed a good friendship, and by August of 1987, Gary Coulson felt that Rob Liefeld was finally ready to be unleashed on the world. Together, they announced the launch of Liefeld's independent creation, Youngblood, in the pages of that month's Megaton 8. Youngblood was set to debut in the pages of the Megaton special. However, only about 1,200 copies were reportedly pre-ordered, and the Megaton special was canceled before it ever came out. Gary Coulson would cease publication in September of that year, 1987, before finally going out of business altogether shortly thereafter. Out of work, and with the dream of Youngblood seemingly dead in the water, Liefeld was not to be deterred. Never at a loss for connections, Rob Liefeld soon met another major player in the origins of Image Comics that you rarely hear discussed around this time in 1987, Dave Olbrich. Olbrich is a former writer for the Comics Journal and came up with the Kirby Awards, actually. In 1986, after becoming embroiled in somewhat of a controversy surrounding the Kirby Awards and his departure from Fantagraphics, Olbrich and his partner Tom Mason founded Malibu Comics. They were publishing low-budget black and white books, so when they saw the already produced material for Youngblood, they quickly inked a deal with Rob Liefeld sometime in 1988 to release the book as soon as they could. After months of work and a lot of back and forth with Malibu, Liefeld was finally making progress on Youngblood when a friend of his told him about a local comic convention where Marvel and DC would have talent representatives, and he set out with portfolio in hand. Say what you want about the guy, but Rob Liefeld's always seemed impossibly energetic and doggedly persistent. At the convention, DC told him to do a little bit more work, but that they were definitely interested. Marvel hired him on the spot. The work Marvel commissioned Rob Liefeld for wasn't used, though, and instead DC was actually the first to publish Liefeld's work in a Secret Origins piece in July of 1989. There was another guy who was working with a lot of the same people and even contributed to that same issue of Secret Origins that Liefeld was introduced to, who would become a big part of his life, Jim Valentino. Jim Valentino had spent the last 10 years working on Dave Sim of Cerebus fame's imprint Aardvark Vanaheim, and then Renegade Press after that. Valentino was nearly 15 years Liefeld senior and had been involved in basically every aspect of creating a comic book by the time he was introduced to the insanely energetic Rob Liefeld. Liefeld was curious about the ins and outs of making a comic book, and Valentino happened to know how to do it all. He began to teach the curious Liefeld all he could, and the two quickly became friends, eventually sharing a studio space for a time. It was then that DC became impressed enough with Liefeld's work that they decided to give him his first real penciling gig on a book for them. They offered Liefeld a 4-issue Hawk and Dove miniseries, which was going to be written and inked by Karl Kesel. Liefeld quickly contacted Dave Olbrich at Malibu to see if he could compete with DC's page rates. They could not. Friends, Olbrich generously relieved Liefeld of any obligations having to do with Youngblood, and the two would stay in touch and get together whenever they could over the next few years. While his duties on Youngblood were no longer hanging over his head, Liefeld was faced with growing difficulties having to do with Hawk and Dove. The work that Liefeld was producing for DC on the Hawk and Dove title was drawing a lot of attention from fans, but behind the scenes, tensions between Liefeld and DC were mounting. Liefeld hated Karl Kessel's inks. He didn't think the end result felt anything like his work, and Kesel has basically said that's because he was in essence fixing all of Rob Liefeld's mistakes, and there were a lot of them. Kesel reportedly has even said that as Liefeld got closer and closer to missing deadlines, the drawings started showing up with no hands and no feet, and that he was expected to add them during the inking process. Things came to a head, culminating with the famous Hawk and Dove incident on issue 5. I'm not going to get into it here, but if you want to know the whole story, get in the comment section below and let me know. Karl Kesel used a lightbox to redraw that entire issue after editor Mike Carlin literally went at the original art with a razor blade, though. Seriously, it was a mess. And by December of 1989, Liefeld and DC were done. Liefeld quickly got work with Marvel though, and a few months after arriving, Liefeld was assigned to the failing X-Men spinoff New Mutants. This might sound a little bit more prestigious today than it did in the early 90s though. The X titles had been dying a slow death for years under a dwindling readership. Under Liefeld, New Mutants became something of a sensation, however, and is widely considered to be one of the major factors that reinvigorated sales and fan interest in the X books. Liefeld's stuff was selling so well that by February of 1991, he wasn't just drawing New Mutants anymore, he was writing it too. Famously, in his first self-penned issue, number 98, Liefeld introduced Deadpool, which would ultimately prove to be his most iconic and lasting contribution to the comics medium. As sales on New Mutants soared, Liefeld made the decision to completely rebrand the title with a new name. He canceled New Mutants with issue 100 in April of 1991, and then rebooted it as XForce a few months later in August of that same year. If sales had been impressive before, the numbers for XForce 1 were insane. In August of 1991, Rob Liefeld was on top of the world. His Levi's 501 jeans commercial, which had been directed by Spike Lee, was playing on MTV nonstop and featured Liefeld doing what he does best, or likes best, whatever, drawing. And he wasn't just drawing any old thing, he was drawing X-Force. He did an original sketch of Spike Lee that's featured in the commercial, but the rest of the art is all from X-Force. When it was released, no one was ready for what happened next. X-Force broke the world record for the highest-selling modern comic book of all time, which had been set less than 12 months prior by Todd McFarlane with Spider-Man number 1. X-Force number 1 sold more than 4 million copies. Liefeld managed to sell 1.2 million more copies about a team of mutants he had helped create than McFarlane had with Spider-Man. This is how popular Rob Liefeld was at one point. Everyone wanted a piece of him after X-Force number 1. In July of 1991, Rob Liefeld ran into his old friend and would-be publisher Dave Olbrich, who was still running Malibu Comics at the San Diego Comic-Con. Liefeld had both Jim Valentino and Erik Larsen with him, and the four decided to go to dinner and get some drinks after the convention. During the dinner at some point or another, Rob Liefeld asked Olbrich if he would be interested in publishing a book by him. Ulbrich said yes, and Liefeld asked him, what about Erik? What about Jim? Ulbrich said he'd love to publish books by any of them, and in the years following, Jim Valentino has construed this as the first real conversation about Image Comics, even though it seemed like Dave Ulbrich was not aware of how serious Rob Liefeld was. I think it's more likely that Rob Liefeld at that point had other plans for the very book that we're here to talk about tonight. It's unclear whether Rob Liefeld was asking if Ulbrich would hire both Larsen and Valentino to work on that book, or Liefeld was actually fishing for work on the behest of his friends. What is clear and extremely important is that it became apparent to Rob Liefeld that with or without Marvel and DC Comics, he was more than capable of making a comic book and getting it released. As a side note of extreme interest to anyone paying attention here, Marvel went public with their stock that same month in July of 1991. They were flying high, and it seemed like the sky was the limit with artistic juggernauts like Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, and Todd McFarlane cranking out work for them. Following going public, Marvel grew more and more aggressive about marketing their characters on clothes, toys, posters, and anything else that they could plaster them on. And by them, I obviously mean drawings of those characters by guys like Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, and Jim Lee. It didn't matter to Marvel that they were using Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man on a shirt. They owned Spider-Man, and they owned that art. Or at least that's how Marvel felt. The would-be Image founding fathers, though, well, they didn't take too kindly to this type of thought. For all the animosity and aggression from Todd McFarlane especially, all McFarlane and the other artists wanted was what they viewed as fair compensation. And this isn't what I think you or I would rationally call fair compensation either. McFarlane says that they had been so maligned and mistreated that they were beyond being paid for the art being used. They just wanted a copy of the stuff it was being used on. If Marvel had just agreed to give them their proper dues and compensated them a little better for sales, they would have stayed with Marvel, and McFarlane was not shy about this. He, as well as I believe Rob Liefeld and even Jim Lee, brought this up with Marvel editorial on numerous occasions. Marvel refused to budge at all, insisting that they were paying enough as it was and that the artists should be happy with what they were getting. There were grumblings, but what were you going to do? Well, Todd McFarlane had an idea. Supposedly, Todd McFarlane talked a great deal about forming a union of sorts, not unlike the idea of Bernard Krigstein's Society of Comic Book Illustrators. Unlike Krigstein, who wanted to work out better wages and better compensation with the publishers that they were already working with, though, McFarlane suggested a mass walkout. Todd McFarlane believed that it was the art, or rather his art, that was selling books for Marvel. Not Marvel's characters or the writers, it was his art. And during this period, he's probably not wrong. This was the same year Chris Claremont got kicked off of the X-Men book, so Jim Lee could do what he wanted with the series without interference from Claremont. Because of this preferential treatment to artists, I never believed that McFarlane was repeatedly clashing with editorial over the content of his Spider-Man title to the extent that he has claimed, until Tom DeFalco confirmed something very interesting in a 2006 interview for Image: The Road to Independence. Todd McFarlane had not been given the adjectiveless Spider-Man title because he had asked for it, or even because he was popular or selling well at all. DeFalco had been on vacation overseas and noticed that they were starved for Spider-Man content in Europe and thought that there was an opportunity to make more money. He had zero interest in giving Todd McFarlane an even bigger head, or worse yet, any more power. Tom DeFalco didn't particularly like Todd McFarlane, and the two often fought over what DeFalco thought was appropriate to publish in a Spider-Man title. McFarlane didn't just talk about quitting Spider-Man all the time. He talked about quitting comics altogether. Apparently, he talked a lot, but I've never heard anyone say that Todd McFarlane ever made any type of serious attempt at actually organizing a union or a walkout. Things between DeFalco and McFarlane, regardless, would reach a head soon enough. But while McFarlane might have just been talking and beating his chest like he often does, he was inadvertently planting the seeds for how Rob Liefeld would react to his next big run-in with Marvel editorial. Then, in the midst of this growing animosity, on September 9th, 1991, in the Comic Buyer's Guide, Rob Liefeld took out a simple one-page black and white ad. An ad that would change the face of comics forever. It featured 5 characters, all thinly veiled ripoffs of pre-existing X-Men characters, in a book to be titled The Executioners, with the text reading, "Rebel mutants from the future come to destroy their past. Catch a glimpse of them in this limited edition print available now exclusively from Image Comics." It was signed and limited to 1,500 copies and retailed for $15 postage paid. While it doesn't feature the distinctive eye logo, Youngblood was most certainly intended to be the first book at Rob Liefeld's personal creator-owned character imprint that he named Image Comics. The figures are obviously Domino, Cable, Wolfsbane, or Feral maybe, Rogue, and Juggernaut clones, but it's honestly not a whole lot more shameless than any other thing I've ever seen in comics. Marvel was having none of it though. Rob Liefeld was awakened by a phone call at 6 a.m. the next day from his editor asking him what he thought he was doing. Liefeld tried to explain, but Terry Stewart in particular was having none of it. He told Liefeld that if he printed the book, then not only was he fired from X-Force and from Marvel Comics, but that they would sue him.
Midway through my X-Force run, I took a full-page ad out, the Comic Book Buyer's Guide, which was the weekly comic book newspaper, announcing the arrival of the Executioners. I was awakened at 6:30 in the morning. It was the editor-in-chief of Marvel. "Do you want a lawsuit? Is that what you're looking at? I don't know what you're thinking of doing here, but what are you doing? What are you doing?" And he asked me that 12 times. I'm like, I just want to do my own thing. There's nothing sinister here. I just I want to do my own thing. Not this thing, not this thing. If this call doesn't go well, legal is going to get involved. Are we clear?
And if anything, that kind of emboldened Rob.
These guys really do think that if we went and did something, that it might be big.
Liefeld agreed to not publish the book, but this power play on Marvel's end ended up backfiring badly. Really, really badly. While Liefeld wouldn't end up releasing Youngblood, at least not at that point, Marvel had shown Liefeld something very important. They were scared. They were terrified about Rob Liefeld, one guy publishing a small independent book on his own. Liefeld reasoned that if Marvel perceived him as a threat on his own, if he could manage to recruit one or two other people of his stature for the idea that had begun to germinate in his brain, he could really do some damage. And so, with the newly revised idea of Image ruminating in his mind, Liefeld set out to recruit other unhappy souls for his proposed rebellion. Rob Liefeld chose Erik Larsen and Jim Valentino as his test subjects. He'd known them forever, and his secret was safe with them, whether they chose to join him or not. Plus, they were at the dinner meeting with Dave Olbrich, where Image Comics was born in one form or another. Erik Larsen had been getting some pushback about his stories at Marvel, but his biggest problem was that he didn't want to sign away the rights to the characters he was drawing and creating for the story arcs he was working on. It had become enough of a problem that when Rob Liefeld came around talking about Image Comics, and especially creators retaining rights, Erik Larsen doesn't seem like he took a whole lot of convincing. Jim Valentino, though, was a hard sell. Jim Valentino is the only Image founder that wasn't on a title that was literally selling 1 million copies a month. Every single other Image founding father knew that at least a fraction of that readership would follow them from Marvel to Image, and that would translate into thousands of readers already in place and interested in what they were putting out. At least that was the idea. Jim Valentino has 5 kids, though. He was not super enthused with the idea when it was first proposed to him. After some thinking and a lot of soul searching, though, Valentino eventually agreed to join. Apparently, though, the other Image partners, especially Todd McFarlane, took a lot of convincing to let him join, and Rob Liefeld is the only person who really wanted him there. The funniest thing about this is that without Jim Valentino, who is basically the only guy aside from Jim Lee with any kind of real business sense, and the only Image founder with a firm grasp on every aspect and step involving the production of a comic book, Image Comics could never have survived. Valentino is one of the unsung heroes of Image Comics, and even now Todd McFarlane will conveniently leave him out of stories and not mention Jim Valentino.
Well, he didn't just talk to me, he talked to the 3 people. There were 4 of us, Todd, not 3, 4.
With all of the stories that you have heard or might hear, always remember that before Todd McFarlane even knew about Image Comics, Jim Valentino had already taken time to think over the proposition and agreed to join. That's how much longer he knew than anyone else other than Erik Larsen. With fellow superstar artist Erik Larsen and the jack-of-all-trades Jim Valentino on board, Liefeld had the core group that he needed to create and release comics to compete with Marvel. Anything else was just gravy, and there would be plenty of that soon enough. In October of 1991, Todd McFarlane was once again embroiled in another clash with Marvel editorial about the contents of his story and the Comics Code. This might sound funny to some people today who didn't grow up under the oppressive shadow of the Comics Code Authority. Trust me, it's not. The Comics Code Authority was a problem that people had been dealing with for decades, but Todd McFarlane didn't take kindly to being told who or what he could write about, and he never has. McFarlane swore the fight with Marvel, this time over Shatterstar, graphically stabbing the Juggernaut directly in his freaking eyeball in an X-Force issue featuring Spider-Man, would be his last. He was done. Tom DeFalco and Todd McFarlane might disagree on a lot of stuff, but when either one of them tells the story, it always ends with McFarlane telling Tom DeFalco, "You do realize this means at some point I'm going to leave." After Spider-Man number 16, it would be almost a year before McFarlane produced another piece of art for a comic book. During the interim, a lifelong sports enthusiast, McFarlane was reportedly thinking about retiring from comics altogether and starting a baseball card company. The bottom was falling out of the baseball card industry, like I mentioned though, and while this would seemingly put an end to McFarlane's dreams of a card company, it's actually something that would be pivotal to the success of Image Comics. Tom DeFalco has said over and over that it was not the Juggernaut panel that made McFarlane quit Marvel, however. That was just an excuse. One way or another, Todd McFarlane was going to find a reason to leave. Tom DeFalco says this is the story of Marvel. Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, they got popular, they got power, and then at some point or another, they began to believe they were more important than the characters, and they left Marvel. He was going to be damned if he gave Todd McFarlane, a snotty little upstart, that kind of power, especially over a Spider-Man title, and this is the kind of working relationship that McFarlane and DeFalco had. So when Rob Liefeld approached McFarlane about Image Comics, he was definitely the easiest sell. I'm not sure Rob Liefeld really had to say a lot more than want to leave Marvel. Todd McFarlane was done with the big two, and he wasn't afraid of telling anyone who asked, even before the idea of Image Comics was proposed to him. With McFarlane now involved, Rob Liefeld knew it wasn't long before someone let something slip, or they were discovered by Marvel, or maybe even DC. It was time to make their move. It was then that Todd McFarlane began working an angle that would cement their threat to Marvel Comics. At some point between October and November of that year, Jim Lee had been approached about joining Image Comics. If Valentino was trepidatious about joining, it seems Lee was all but petrified though. McFarlane's clashes with editorial were open knowledge, and Rob Liefeld was well known as something of a troublemaker. Jim Lee was the respectable businessman though. He was always polite and well dressed and did what he was told. Lee rarely speaks of his time at Marvel Comics in general, and I'm not sure I've ever heard him address the issues that motivated him to leave Marvel Comics in earnest. In an interview for Hero magazine, Lee did recall of his Marvel days shortly after forming Image Comics that Scott Williams, Waltz Portacio, and himself had formed what would become Homage Studios because of deep feelings of isolation from Marvel editorial, as well as being completely unable to get any real feedback on their work. Lee said that he never really felt like he was part of the Marvel machine, and if he still felt like that after having the highest selling comic of all time, he probably knew he wasn't going to be fitting in anytime soon. Lee wasn't interested in burning bridges, or in McFarlane's case, nuking them from orbit though. Jim Lee wanted to at least leave the door open to coming back to Marvel or DC. Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane had all been invited to attend the December 18th, 1991 Sotheby's original comic book art auction by Marvel, but only Jim Lee had originally planned on attending. McFarlane and Liefeld reportedly only went to talk Lee into joining Image. The night before the auction, December 17th, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane had an impromptu meeting with Marvel president Terry Stewart and editor Tom DeFalco, and they had a meeting scheduled with DC the next day on the 18th. The reason for these meetings has never really been made clear. Todd McFarlane claims that they were to give Marvel and DC a heads up about what was happening. This seems rather unlikely though, and it's clear that both Rob Liefeld and especially Jim Lee thought that these were negotiation talks with Marvel and DC to get better compensation packages. Todd McFarlane is a talker though. He always has been. It seems like McFarlane just likes to prove he has the biggest balls in the room sometimes. Marvel was raking in money hand over fist, using their art on any and all conceivable merchandise you can think of, and Todd McFarlane was done with being taken advantage of, or taking part in a system that took advantage of people like that. I think Todd McFarlane wanted to tell them why he was leaving, tell them all the horrible things that they were doing to their artists, which apparently is basically what he did. Accounts of exactly what happened at that December 17th meeting with Marvel are pretty varied, but there's one constant. At one point or another, Terry Stewart and Tom DeFalco made it very clear, in no uncertain terms, to Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane, that it was Marvel's position that the characters sold the books, not the artists, not the writers. Everything and everyone about a book was completely replaceable except for Marvel's characters. This enraged McFarlane, but for Jim Lee, I think it was the first time he became acutely aware that Liefeld and McFarlane had very valid points about not really being appreciated at Marvel on any level. Jim Lee had shattered the world record for most comics sold by almost doubling it, and Marvel didn't even really seem interested in trying to offer him anything to stick around. Lee, Liefeld, and McFarlane were told to take a day and think about things and come back, but a key event took place: the Sothebys Auction. The auction probably did little but help fan the growing flames of dissent among Marvel's ranks. The Sothebys Auction was the first large-scale auction from a prestigious auction house of its kind, and there was a wide array of original art offered for sale from the Golden Age to the present. It all fetched far more than anyone ever imagined. Among the pieces offered by Marvel was the complete original art for Spider-Man #1 by Todd McFarlane, X-Force #1 by Rob Liefeld, and X-Men #1 by Jim Lee. Both X-Force and X-Men were in the top 3 highest realized prices. X-Force went for a whopping $35,000, and the X-Men art by Jim Lee, only topped by an original Frank Frazetta Vampirella painting, sold for an incredible $40,000. Marvel retained all profits from the sale. He's never said it, and he somehow always manages to avoid talking about exactly how, when, and why he was approached about Image and agreed to do it, but seeing his original art fetch $40,000 and knowing that it was all going into the pocket of people that had literally nothing to do with its creation might have been Jim Lee's breaking point. That art was already making them millions of dollars in comic sales and merchandise, much of which he was not getting paid for. Jim Lee is a businessman. 40 grand is not chump change, and if there's one language that Jim Lee speaks, it is definitely dollars and cents. That, however, is simply supposition on my end. Regardless of his reasons, while Lee might have been one of the last and most unlikely to join, without him the company would likely have never survived. This is not to downplay anyone else's importance or contributions, but Jim Lee was an undeniably pivotal figure in the success of Image Comics. He was one of the few people, apart from Jim Valentino, with a level business head, and he definitely helped to keep Image together and fiscally afloat during the trials and tribulations of those first few crucial years. I find this especially ironic considering DC now owns the imprint and the characters that Jim Lee created during his time at Image, but that's another story for another day. And you already know what I'm going to say. If you want to learn more, get in the comments section below and let me know. When Todd McFarlane tells a story about the meeting with DC the next day, it's always the exact same. He says everyone's eyes got big when Jim Lee walked in because he'd never been there, and they thought he was there looking for work, and they were very confused when McFarlane launched into his speech about how they wouldn't be working for Marvel or DC. This is almost certainly true, but it probably isn't for the reason that Todd McFarlane thinks it is. Apparently, DC had approached Jim Lee and been in talks with him for a decent period of time around the release of X-Men #1 about Lee helming the launch of the new Batman series. In fact, Lee has said that it actually came down to him either doing Image or doing Batman. DC decided, though, in their infinite wisdom, that someone else would be handling the covers, and Lee was not hot on this. Covers meant a better paycheck, exposure, and name recognition, all things Lee was keenly aware of and unwilling to relinquish. As a result, he said he ended up deciding to help with Image Comics. As if by fate, Mark Silvestri also happened to be in New York, staying at the exact same hotel as the Image founders the night before their fateful meetings with Marvel and DC Comics, despite the fact he was thinking about leaving comics altogether. When Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane ran into him in the lobby of the hotel after attending the Sotheby's auction, McFarlane decided to hit him with a hard sell on Image Comics. Apparently, Todd McFarlane took Mark Silvestri into the hotel bar, and they had a long conversation about what Image Comics was going to be and the whole idea of creator-owned characters, and at the end, McFarlane asked him if he wanted to join. McFarlane then told Silvestri that he needed his answer by 8 a.m. when the meetings with Marvel and DC editorial were scheduled the next day. Needless to say, when Todd McFarlane famously strolled into the Marvel editorial offices the next day to tell them his now infamous Watch story,
He'll give me his whole speech like, I sold 2 million copies for you, Marvel. I didn't even get a watch. I didn't get a plaque. My dad got a watch when he worked at the factory.
he wasn't just representing the 4 guys he had come to New York for. He was now representing a formidable 6-man lineup of all-star talent that would form the core of Image Comics. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. As always, links to all of my sources as well as any digitally available content and further reading can be found in the description link below. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, hit that like button and think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoyed what you saw, Hulk smash the subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss a bit of trivia or history from your dear old Uncle Jerk. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, have any questions, or you have a suggestion for an episode that you'd like to see in the future, please think about getting in the comments section and letting me know. Not only does it really help out the channel, but I am working on some incredibly amazing stuff from viewer suggestions at this very moment. Thanks again for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only 2 things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.